Have you ever wondered what happens when justice comes knocking, decades after a crime was committed? Today, we're diving deep into some of the most chilling cases of elderly inmates who face the death penalty in the United States. These weren't young men acting on impulse. These were aging individuals, some who spent years, even decades, awaiting their fate on death row, others who committed unspeakable acts late in life. We'll walk through their crimes, the chilling words they spoke before dying, and even the curious meals they chose for their final night on earth. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of story you don't want to miss. Let's begin with a case that stunned the nation. John David Battaglia, 62. It was a crime that sent a chill through the entire country, not just for what happened, but how it happened. On the night of February 1st, 2018, inside the death chamber at Huntsville, Texas, 62-year-old John David Battaglia took his final breath. The reason? A crime so personal, so cruel, that even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. Let's rewind to May 2nd, 2001. In a quiet Dallas apartment, Battaglia was spending court-approved time with his daughters, 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty. Their mother, Mary Jean Pearl, had no idea she was about to live through every parent's worst nightmare over the phone. Moments before the horror unfolded, Battaglia handed the phone to Faith. On the line, Mary Jean heard her daughter ask, "Mommy, why do you want Daddy to go to jail?" It wasn't a question, it was a trap. Seconds later, gunshots. Mary Jean was forced to listen as her daughters were murdered, helpless and paralyzed by the sound of pure evil. But it didn't end there. With the phone line still open, Battaglia left the apartment, drove straight to a tattoo parlor, and had roses inked onto his arm. Inside those flowers, the names of the daughters he had just killed. What drove him? Revenge. Mary Jean had filed assault charges against him after years of abuse, and this was his twisted way of punishing her. At trial, his violent past and unstable mental health were laid bare. But what sealed his fate was the sheer emotional cruelty of his actions, forcing a mother to hear her daughter's final screams. He spent 17 years on death row. Over time, his mental condition seemed to spiral. His attorneys insisted he was too delusional to execute, arguing that he believed the whole thing was a staged government plot. But the courts didn't buy it. Then came his final moment. As the drugs began to flow, Battaglia smirked and said, "Go ahead, please. Don't worry about it. I'll get my hands on a computer when I get back to my cell, and I'll do the transcription myself." 9:40 p.m. He was gone. Watching from the witness room, Mary Jean Pearl stood still, bearing witness to the end of a man who had once been her husband and later her nightmare. Betty Lou Beets, 62. Some killers hide in the shadows. Betty Lou Beets? She buried her secrets in the backyard and nearly got away with it. On February 24th, 2000, 62-year-old Beets was executed by lethal injection, making history as just the second woman to be executed in Texas since the 1800s. But her story isn't just about her death. It's about what led up to it, and it's chilling. Beets had walked down the aisle 5 times. Her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, a well-liked Dallas firefighter, was the last. In August 1983, while Jimmy slept peacefully, Betty Lou pulled out a pistol and shot him twice in the head. Then, with a coldness that shocked everyone later, she buried his body underneath a wishing well in the yard. Afterward, she calmly told friends Jimmy had disappeared, maybe run off, maybe had an accident. Meanwhile, she collected his pension and life insurance. For nearly 2 years, no one suspected a thing. But greed has a way of unraveling even the most careful plan. In 1985, she tried cashing in another life insurance policy, and that raised red flags. Investigators showed up to search her property. What they found stunned even the police. Under that wishing well, Jimmy's remains. But the real shocker came next. Beneath a nearby storage shed, they found another body. Her 4th husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, he'd also been shot, also buried in her yard, also insured. The media quickly dubbed her a black widow, a woman who lured men in only to kill them for money. At trial, prosecutors pushed this narrative hard. But Betty Lou's defense team painted a different picture. A woman shaped by years of abuse, trying to survive in a violent world. They argued she didn't kill for greed, but out of fear. Throughout her 15 years on death row, Beats insisted she wasn't the killer, claiming her son was responsible for Jimmy's death. But physical evidence and the timeline told a different story. On the day of her execution, Betty Lou made no special meal request, no last words, just silence. At 6:18 p.m., the sentence was carried out. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered, some shouting for justice, others holding signs against capital punishment. But inside, the woman at the center of it all passed away without a sound, taking the truth, whatever it was, to her grave. Walter Moody Jr., 83, Alabama, April 19, 2018. The clock struck 8:42 p.m. as Walter Leroy Moody Jr. became the oldest person executed in the U.S. since the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976. At 83 years old, he didn't go quietly, and the story that brought him to that moment reads like a thriller filled with vengeance, rage, and explosions. Back in December of 1989, Moody unleashed terror through the mail. His first target, federal judge Robert Vance. The judge opened a package at his Alabama home, only for a bomb inside to explode, killing him instantly and severely injuring his wife. Just 2 days later, another package arrived, this time at a law office in Georgia. Civil rights attorney Robert Robinson opened it. Boom, another life lost. But it didn't stop there. Moody had also mailed bombs to the NAACP in Jacksonville, Florida, and the federal courthouse in Atlanta. Thankfully, those were intercepted before they could detonate. What triggered this rampage? Revenge. Pure, calculated revenge. In 1972, Moody's first wife was injured in a pipe bomb explosion at their home. He was convicted for possessing the device and never forgave the system. He nursed a bitter resentment for years against judges, lawyers, and the federal establishment. That grudge eventually erupted into violence. Federal agents poured everything into the case. It became one of the largest investigations of its kind. Forensic experts linked him to the bombs through everything from chemical traces to his purchase history. Prosecutors would later reveal he had even invented a fake group, Americans for a Free America, to falsely claim responsibility and steer attention away from himself. In 1996, a jury found Moody guilty on 71 counts, including 2 for capital murder. He sat on death row for over 22 years, refusing to admit guilt, appealing every decision, and aging behind bars. On the night of his execution, his meal was oddly specific: Philly cheesesteaks, M&Ms, and a can of Dr. Pepper. When asked for any last words, Moody looked ahead and gave a simple, cold reply: no. And just like that, the curtain closed on one of the most vindictive, long-burning criminal stories in American history. Bigler Stauffer, 79, Oklahoma. Next up, a case fueled by obsession and heartbreak. On December 9, 2021, Bigler Job Bud Stauffer II was put to death by lethal injection at 79 years old, making him one of the oldest individuals ever executed by the state of Oklahoma. The story takes us back to May 28, 1985 in Oklahoma City. What started as a romantic relationship between Stauffer and Linda Reeves, a 73-year-old retired teacher, ended in bloodshed and betrayal. Reeves had been seeing Stauffer, but their relationship turned rocky. Stauffer, riddled with jealousy, suspected she was spending time with other men. One evening, he arrived at her home and found 38-year-old Doug Ivins visiting. That moment lit the fuse. Consumed by rage, Stauffer pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and shot both Reeves and Ivins multiple times. Reeves didn't survive. Ivins died as well. Neighbors, alarmed by the gunfire, called authorities. When officers arrived, they found Stauffer still at the scene. He initially tried to justify his actions, calling it self-defense, but it didn't hold up. Eventually, he admitted to pulling the trigger. The trial painted a grim picture. Prosecutors described him as a manipulative man, unable to handle rejection. His lawyers tried to appeal for mercy, pointing to his clean record and age. But the jury wasn't moved. They sentenced him to death. For 36 long years, Stauffer sat on death row, one of the longest-serving inmates in Oklahoma's history. Throughout, he stuck to his narrative. It was a crime of passion, not premeditated murder. Court after court denied his appeals. When his final day came, Stauffer didn't request a last meal, and prison staff served him the default cafeteria tray. Before his death, his final words struck a softer tone. "My request is that my Father forgive them." Thank you. At 10:16 a.m., it was over. From a jealous rage in 1985 to a state-sanctioned execution more than 3 decades later, Stauffer's story serves as a haunting reminder of how one violent moment can echo for generations. Charles Russell Rhines, 63, South Dakota. On a cold November evening in 2019, the walls of South Dakota State Penitentiary echoed with finality. Inside, Charles Russell Rhines, 63 years old, and over 2 decades deep into a death sentence, was about to face the ultimate consequence for a crime committed in 1992 that still haunted an entire town. It was March 8th of that year when Rhines set out to rob a local donut shop in Rapid City. He thought the place would be empty. It wasn't. Donovan Schaefer, just 22 and fresh-faced with ambition, showed up early for his shift. What happened next turned a routine workday into a nightmare. Rhines tied him up, and when Donovan began to cry, pleading for his life, Rhines grew irritated. According to his later confession, he stabbed Donovan in the head simply because, in his words, the crying was getting on his nerves. That cold admission would linger in the courtroom years later. The murder went unsolved for a while, until someone from Rhines' own past came forward. A former roommate revealed that Rhines had not only confessed, but had laughed while recounting the killing. At trial, his defense tried to argue for life in prison, but prosecutors didn't hold back. They laid out every brutal detail of the crime, the taunting, the cruelty, the complete disregard for human life. The jury chose death. But Rhines' case didn't end there. Years later, a controversy emerged. Some jurors reportedly made homophobic remarks during deliberations, saying prison would be too enjoyable for Rhines, who was openly gay. Legal teams argued that this bias had poisoned the verdict, but appeal after appeal failed to overturn the sentence. Rhines waited 27 years for the state to carry out his execution. On the night it finally happened, he ordered a veggie burger, fries, and lemon pie. Then, with the end just minutes away, he spoke. "I am sorry to the Schaefer family. I hope they find peace." At 7:39 p.m., it was over. The state had just carried out its first execution in 7 years. But for many, the questions his case raised about justice, bias, and humanity remained long after the curtain closed. Thomas Warren Weissenhant, 63, Alabama. In the heart of Alabama, on May 27, 2010, a chapter that had begun more than 3 decades earlier finally came to a close. Thomas Warren Weissenhant was 63 when he was led into the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility. His name had been etched in Alabama's death row roster for 33 years. His crime, one of the most chilling in the state's history. The date was July 12, 1976. Gertrude Trudy Ellison, 72 years old, was at home when Weissenhant forced his way in. He assumed she had money. She didn't. After robbing her of a mere $35, he brutally assaulted her, then shot her 3 times. Her body was found discarded in a remote area outside Mobile County. For a while, Weissenhant walked free, but fate caught up with him the following year when he was arrested for another rape. During questioning, he cracked and confessed to Trudy's murder. He even led police to evidence he had kept as 6 souvenirs from the crime. At his trial, his attorneys painted a picture of a broken man, traumatized by childhood abuse, struggling with mental illness. But the jury couldn't look past the horrifying details. An elderly woman attacked in her own home. $35. A life lost in the most brutal way. The verdict was clear: death. Over the next 33 years, Weissenhant changed, or at least that's what those who knew him in prison believed. He turned to religion, became a born-again Christian, and mentored other inmates. But for the Ellison family, no amount of reform could rewrite the past. When his final day came, he requested fried catfish, hush puppies, potato salad, and pecan pie. Then, standing before the witnesses, he offered an apology. "I am sorry for what I did Mrs. Ellison and her family. I have made peace with God. I'm ready." At 6:20 p.m., his heart stopped beating, and with it ended one of the longest journeys from courtroom to execution in Alabama's history. Joseph Paul Franklin, 63, Missouri. In the early morning hours of November 20th, 2013, one of America's most chilling chapters of racial violence finally closed. Joseph Paul Franklin, a name synonymous with hate-fueled terror, was executed at Missouri's Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center. He was 63 years old, and his legacy was one of bloodshed, fueled by twisted ideology. Born James Clayton Vaughn Jr., he changed his name to Joseph Paul Franklin, an unsettling tribute to both founding father Benjamin Franklin and Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels. His mission? To ignite a race war across the U.S. Between 1977 and 1980, Franklin crisscrossed the country with a rifle and a grudge, targeting interracial couples, black men, and Jewish citizens. At least 11 confirmed victims fell to his racist crusade, though Franklin himself boasted the number could be closer to 20. His acts were bold and brutal. In St. Louis, he gunned down Gerald Gordon outside a synagogue. This was the murder that ultimately sealed his death sentence. But his notoriety didn't stop there. In 1978, Franklin ambushed Larry Flynt, the provocative publisher of Hustler magazine. Why? Because the magazine dared to feature interracial content. Flynt survived, but spent the rest of his life paralyzed. Then in 1980, Franklin struck again, this time targeting civil rights leader Vernon Jordan. Jordan survived the attempt on his life, but the damage, both physical and symbolic, was deep. Franklin was finally captured later that year. He faced a cascade of murder convictions, receiving 6 life sentences and 1 sentence of death. Despite nearly 33 years in prison, Franklin never apologized, never showed remorse, and never let go of the beliefs that turned him into one of the most feared racist killers in modern history. No final meal, no final statement, just silence. Ironically, one of the voices that spoke against his execution belonged to Larry Flynt himself. Despite being confined to a wheelchair because of Franklin's bullet, Flynt publicly opposed the death penalty, even for his own shooter. At 6:17 a.m., the execution was complete. For many, justice had been long delayed. For others, the questions surrounding hate, punishment, and justice still echo. John Ruthel Henry, 63. On June 18, 2014, the sun set over Florida State Prison, and with it came the end of a tragic, violent story. At 63, John Ruthel Henry was put to death for a crime that left a scar on his family, and especially his son, that time couldn't heal. The crime unfolded 2 days before Christmas in 1985. In Pasco County, Florida, Henry forced his way into the home of his estranged wife, Suzanne. She had left him after years of abuse. She had a restraining order. She had tried to protect herself, but none of it stopped him. Armed with a knife and rage, Henry attacked Suzanne in front of their 5-year-old son, Eugene. The child watched helplessly as his mother was stabbed to death by the man who was supposed to love her. Later, Eugene would take the stand as a key witness, his childhood shattered before it even began. The courtroom heard more than just the details of that one horrific night. Prosecutors laid out Henry's long pattern of domestic violence, his history of violating court orders, and his repeated threats. The jury took all of it in and recommended death, not just for the brutality, but because of the emotional destruction left in the wake, especially on the child. Henry spent 28 years on death row. In that time, he wrote letters to his son, trying to reconnect. He claimed the murder wasn't planned, that it happened in a moment of emotional collapse. He did eventually show signs of remorse. On the night of his execution, he declined a special last meal. When asked if he had any final words, he took a deep breath and said, "I can't undo what I've done. If I could, I would. I ask for your forgiveness if you can find it in your heart." At 7:43 p.m., the execution was carried out. A man whose rage took away a mother and a childhood left this world quietly, but the pain he caused lives on, especially in the heart of the boy who grew up too fast in the shadow of tragedy. Keith Edmund Gavin, 64, Alabama. On the evening of July 18, 2024, the state of Alabama carried out the execution of Keith Edmund Gavin, a man whose life had been marked by violence and whose final chapter ended in the sterile chamber of Holman Correctional Facility. He was 64 years old. The crime that sealed Gavin's fate happened over 2 decades earlier, on March 6, 1998, in the quiet rural stretches of Cherokee County. William Clinton Clayton Jr., a 68-year-old delivery driver, had pulled over to an ATM. It was a simple errand, part of his routine. He was withdrawing cash for his business. That's when Gavin struck. He approached Clayton with a gun and demanded the money. Clayton, compliant and unarmed, handed it over, just $580. But instead of walking away, Gavin pulled the trigger. A single cold shot to the face. Clayton was left to die alone inside his van. And here's what makes this even more chilling. This wasn't Gavin's first murder. Back in 1979, he had already taken a life. He was paroled years later and had a long rap sheet of violent offenses. Yet he was out again, and another innocent man paid the price. At trial, prosecutors didn't mince words. They painted Gavin as a habitual predator, a man who turned every second chance into another tragedy. The jury didn't hesitate. The sentence, death. Over the next 26 years, Gavin underwent a dramatic shift, at least on the surface. He converted to Islam, grew deeply religious, and expressed remorse in personal letters. While some saw sincerity, others weren't convinced it could undo the destruction he'd caused. When his execution day arrived, Gavin declined the traditional last meal. Instead, he had a simple snack, ice cream and a Mountain Dew. As he lay on the gurney, his final words were directed to the people who had stood by him. I love my family. At exactly 6:32 p.m., Keith Edmund Gavin was pronounced dead. Another chapter in Alabama's long and controversial history of capital punishment had come to a close. Richard Snell, 64, April 19, 1995. While the world's attention was consumed by breaking news out of Oklahoma City, inside the Cummins unit in Arkansas, another event was unfolding, less publicized but eerily connected by theme and ideology. That night, Richard Wayne Snell, 64 years old, was executed by lethal injection. A white supremacist, a murderer, and a man who showed no regret to the very end. Let's rewind to June 30th, 1984. In the small city of Texarkana, Arkansas, pawn shop owner Bill Stump was running his business as usual. Snell walked in with a gun, a grudge, and a twisted belief that Stump, who was Jewish, was part of a massive conspiracy against white Christians. He shot and killed Stump without mercy. But that wasn't his only crime. Just a year earlier, in 1983, Arkansas State Trooper Lewis Bryant pulled Snell over during a routine traffic stop. Snell didn't hesitate. He pulled out a gun and fired 5 times, killing Bryant, a black officer, in cold blood. Snell was no loner acting on impulse. He was part of a violent extremist group called the Covenant, the Sword and the Arm of the Lord, a white supremacist militia bent on waging war against the government and anyone they considered the enemy. As his execution date approached, conspiracy theories swirled. Some noticed the chilling timing. Snell's death fell exactly 2 years after the deadly siege at Waco, and the same day as the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people. While some speculated about links between Snell and Timothy McVeigh, investigators found no credible connection. During his 11 years on death row, Snell never once backed away from his hateful beliefs. He preached defiance until the very end. And in his final moments, he didn't plead for forgiveness. He issued a warning. Governor Tucker, look over your shoulder. Justice is coming. I wouldn't trade places with you or any of your cronies. Hell has its victories. I am at peace. At 9:10 p.m., the needle delivered its final judgment. Snell was gone. But the dark ideologies he represented, those still ripple through history, making his execution day and its eerie coincidence with the Oklahoma City bombing all the more haunting. John Errol Ferguson, 65, Florida. On August 5, 2013, the execution chamber at Florida State Prison prepared for the end of a man whose crimes and disturbing mind had haunted the state for decades. John Errol Ferguson, 65 years old, was strapped to the gurney. But in his mind, he wasn't a convicted killer. He was the Prince of God. To understand the terror Ferguson unleashed, we need to go back to the summer of 1977. On July 27th, Ferguson, alongside 2 accomplices, invaded a quiet home in Carroll City. Inside were 8 innocent people. 6 of them were forced to lie down, bound at the wrists, and then one by one executed with a bullet to the head. The scene was chilling, methodical, merciless, and beyond comprehension. 6 months later, he struck again. This time, it was a robbery at a lover's lane. His victims were just 17 years old, Brian Glenfeld and Belinda Worley. After robbing them of only $30, he shot both teenagers execution style. Ferguson was eventually caught and convicted of 8 brutal murders, but his case didn't follow the usual path through death row. Over the 35 years he spent awaiting execution, Ferguson's grip on reality unraveled. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses, He insisted he was divine royalty. He believed he had fathered 13 children with the Virgin Mary and that his death would be temporary because he'd returned from the grave to save humanity. His attorneys fought hard, arguing that executing a man so deeply delusional violated constitutional protections. Medical experts agreed he was profoundly ill, but the courts focused on one question: did he understand he was being punished for murder? Ultimately, the answer was yes, and the execution moved forward. Ferguson's final meal was a country fried chicken sandwich and sweet tea. His final words, spoken with complete conviction, were, "I am the Prince of God." At 6:17 p.m., John Errol Ferguson was declared dead. But for those who had watched his descent into madness, the execution raised difficult questions. Was it justice or something far more unsettling? Robert Joseph Long, 65. On May 23, 2019, Florida put to death a man whose name had haunted the Tampa Bay area since the 1980s. Robert Joseph Long, known across headlines as Bobby Joe Long, was executed at the age of 65. For many, it marked the final chapter in one of Florida's most terrifying killing sprees. His crimes unfolded over just 8 months in 1984, but the damage he caused spanned generations. Long had a chilling routine. He prowled the night, targeting women who were alone, many of them sex workers. He'd kidnap them, brutally assault them, and eventually kill them, often by strangulation. Their bodies were left in isolated areas, discarded like trash. Police were hunting a ghost. But then one of his intended victims did the unthinkable. She survived. Lisa McVie was just 17 years old when Long abducted her. She was held for 26 hours, assaulted repeatedly, but she didn't panic. Instead, she talked to him, asked about his life, showed him empathy. Somehow, she convinced him to let her go. And when she did, she went straight to police with a razor-sharp memory of every detail she had seen, heard, and felt during captivity. That courage cracked the case wide open. Long was arrested, and under questioning, he confessed with disturbing ease. He pleaded guilty to 8 murders and received a death sentence for the killing of Michelle Sims. He was also handed multiple life sentences for the other victims. He spent 35 years on death row, quiet, emotionless, and rarely speaking about his crimes. Even as new DNA evidence tied him to additional murders, Long remained a mystery, even to himself. In a rare final interview, he said, "I'm not proud of anything I've done, and the worst thing is I don't understand why. I don't understand why." For his final meal, he chose roast beef, bacon, French fries, and soda. He declined to give any last words. At 6:55 p.m., Robert Joseph Long was pronounced dead. In the witness room were several of his victims' family members, and Lisa McVie herself, now a sheriff's deputy. Her survival had not only saved her own life, but countless others. In the end, it wasn't Long's violence that defined the legacy of this case. It was Lisa's strength. Richard Norman Rojam Jr., 66, Oklahoma. On the morning of June 27, 2024, a chapter spanning 4 decades finally closed behind the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Richard Norman Rojam Jr., 66, was executed by lethal injection, a sentence delivered for a crime that left a small community devastated and a family forever changed. The date was July 7, 1984. In the quiet town of Elk City, Oklahoma, 7-year-old Layla Dawn Cummings was taken from her home. Her disappearance sparked an urgent search. Days turned to weeks. And then, the heartbreaking discovery: her body was found in a field outside town. The suspect was someone once trusted by the family. Rojam had previously been married to Layla's mother. But the shock deepened when his criminal history surfaced. Just months before, Rojam had completed a prison sentence in Michigan for assaulting 2 teenage girls. Investigators pieced together the evidence. Fingerprints on a discarded cup near the scene and a DNA match tied Rojam to the crime. He was arrested in Michigan and brought back to Oklahoma, where a jury convicted him after a highly publicized trial. For the next 40 years, one of the longest stretches on Oklahoma's death row, Rojam challenged the verdict through every legal avenue. His attorneys eventually argued that carrying out the sentence after so many years was excessive, but the courts held firm. In his final hours, Rojam declined to make a public statement. His last meal request was simple and familiar: 2 personal-sized pepperoni pizzas, vanilla ice cream, and ginger ale. When asked if he had anything to say before the execution, he quietly responded, "I don't. I've said my goodbyes." At 10:16 a.m., the sentence was carried out. For those closest to the case, it marked the end of a long and painful wait for accountability. Oba Chandler, 65, Florida. On November 15, 2011, the state of Florida carried out one of its most closely watched executions in recent history. Oba Chandler, 65, was put to death at Florida State Prison for a crime that had haunted the Gulf Coast for over 20 years. It was June 1st, 1989, when Joan Rogers and her two teenage daughters, Michelle and Christy, met Chandler while vacationing in Florida. He offered them a boat ride at sunset, a seemingly friendly gesture during their trip. But what began as a tourist experience ended in tragedy. The family never returned from that outing. 3 days later, their bodies were found in Tampa Bay. With no immediate leads, the case remained unsolved for years until investigators found a crucial clue, a handwritten note with directions given by a man they later identified as Chandler. Combined with DNA evidence, the puzzle finally came together. In court, prosecutors presented more than just forensic proof. They introduced testimony suggesting Chandler had engaged in similar behavior before. The jury took only 2 hours to reach a decision: capital punishment. For 17 years, Chandler remained on death row. He insisted he had been wrongly accused and maintained his innocence until the end. He initially refused to attend his own execution, but was ultimately present. His final meal was straightforward: fried chicken, French fries, and strawberry ice cream. He left behind a written statement repeating his claim of innocence: "You are killing an innocent man today." At 4:25 p.m., the execution was completed. Though the case stirred public debate, especially regarding the nature of capital punishment, many saw it as the final step in a long search for justice in a case that gripped Florida for decades. Clarence Wayne Dixon, 66, Arizona. On May 11, 2022, inside Florence State Prison, Arizona, carried out its first execution in nearly a decade. The man at the center of this long-delayed punishment was 66-year-old Clarence Wayne Dixon, a figure whose crimes had haunted the state since the late 1970s. The date was January 7, 1978. Deanna Bowden, a 21-year-old student at Arizona State University, was found murdered in her Tempe apartment. For over 2 decades, the case remained cold until advancements in DNA technology cracked it wide open in 2001. The evidence pointed directly to Dixon. The revelation came with another shock. At the time of Deanna's death, Dixon had been out on bail for the sexual assault of another ASU student committed just 2 days earlier. He had a disturbing history of violence, and his past began to unravel quickly in the courtroom. But the path to execution wasn't simple. Dixon's mental health raised serious concerns. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, he had long believed he was being controlled by government-installed microchips. His defense team insisted he was too mentally ill to fully understand his punishment, making execution, they argued, unconstitutional. Ultimately, Arizona's courts determined he was aware enough of his crimes and the consequences, and the execution moved forward. In his final hours, Dixon requested a simple meal: KFC, strawberry ice cream, and a bottle of water. When asked for final words, he said, "Maybe I'll see you on the other side, Deanna. I don't know you, and I don't remember you." At 10:30 a.m., Clarence Wayne Dixon was pronounced dead. His case not only closed a decades-old chapter, but reopened conversations about mental illness and the justice system's limits. Donnie Cleveland Lance, 66, Georgia. On the evening of January 29, 2020, Georgia carried out the execution of Donnie Cleveland Lance, age 66, a man convicted of a double murder that stemmed from years of tension, resentment, and personal turmoil. Back in November 1997, in Jackson County, Georgia, a domestic conflict exploded into fatal violence. Lance arrived at the home of his ex-wife, Sabrina Lance, and her partner, Dwight Butch Wood Jr. Armed and enraged, he shot both victims multiple times in front of witnesses. The motive? A long-standing custody battle combined with a court-ordered child support ruling. Lance reportedly believed he was losing control over his family, and he responded with deadly force. The legal journey that followed was long and contentious. Lance spent 22 years on death row. as his attorneys fought against Georgia's execution methods and raised concerns about secrecy around lethal injection drugs. But those appeals failed to stop the clock. Throughout those years, Lance maintained he had acted in self-defense, claiming that Dwight Wood had threatened him. But eyewitnesses and court testimony painted a very different picture, one of premeditated violence and a man unwilling to let go of control. Before his execution, Lance requested a final meal of chili steak burgers, fries, onion rings, condiments, and a soda. When asked if he had any last words, he gave a short and quiet reply, no. At 9:05 p.m., Donnie Lance was pronounced dead. For the families of Sabrina and Dwight, it marked the end of a decades-long legal saga and the closing of a chapter filled with pain, conflict, and unanswered questions. Frank Jarvis Atwood, 6'6". On the morning of June 8, 2022, the silence inside Florence State Prison was heavy. At exactly 10:16 a.m., Frank Jarvis Atwood was declared dead, marking the end of one of Arizona's most haunting and emotionally charged cases. The story begins on September 17, 1984, in Tucson. 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson left her home to do something simple, mail a birthday card to her aunt. She never came back. Her small pink bicycle was later discovered abandoned in the desert, battered and scraped with paint flakes that would eventually become the most crucial evidence in the case. 7 agonizing months passed before Vicki's remains were found, also in the desert, far from her neighborhood, and the life she never got to live. Suspicion quickly turned to Frank Atwood. He had only recently moved to Arizona after being paroled from a California prison for offenses involving children, including the kidnapping of another 8-year-old. Investigators found paint from Vicki's bicycle on Atwood's car, and in a damning blow, a bracelet known to belong to Vicki was discovered inside his vehicle. The case ripped through the Tucson community, and for decades, Vicki's name remained etched into local memory as a symbol of a stolen childhood. Atwood, meanwhile, sat on death row for 35 years. He consistently maintained that he was innocent, arguing that the evidence had been misinterpreted and that he had been framed. But court after court reviewed the case and upheld the conviction. As the execution date approached, Atwood's health had declined, but he still had enough strength to request a final meal: ribeye steak, baked potato, a salad, and apple pie. He declined to speak directly about the case in his final words. Instead, he turned to faith. "Thank you, precious Father, for coming today and shepherding me into the faith. I pray the Lord have mercy on all of us. I pray the Lord have mercy on me." And then it was over. A case that had lingered in the Arizona courts, the media, and the hearts of a grieving family for almost 40 years came to a solemn close. Danny Paul Bible, 66, June 27, 2018. The prison walls in Huntsville, Texas, bore witness to the final moments of a man whose name had become a synonym for cruelty. Danny Paul Bible, dubbed the Ice Pick Killer, was 66 when he was executed by lethal injection. His crimes were brutal, spanning decades and state lines. The crime that ultimately led to his execution occurred in May 1979. Bible's neighbor, 20-year-old Inez Deaton, had stopped by his home in Houston to use the telephone. What she didn't know was that Bible had no intention of letting her leave. Once inside, he turned violent. When she resisted his advances, he attacked her, strangled her, and stabbed her repeatedly with an ice pick, 11 times in total, before dumping her body in a bayou. For years, her murder went unsolved. But Bible didn't stop there. In 1983, he carried out a horrific triple murder, killing his sister-in-law, her baby, and her roommate in a single day in North Texas. He was also suspected in other sexual assaults and killings in places like Montana and Louisiana, leaving behind a trail of violence that law enforcement would spend years trying to piece together. DNA advancements finally caught up with him in 1998. He was already behind bars, serving a 25-year sentence for a different murder when the evidence tied him back to Inez Deaton. He was charged, convicted, and sentenced to death. Time passed, and Bible's health rapidly declined. When his execution day arrived, he was confined to a wheelchair and dependent on oxygen due to chronic lung issues. Still, the sentence moved forward. He refused to make a formal final statement, but according to witnesses, as the lethal injection began, he muttered 2 words: It hurts, and burning. At 6:32 p.m., Danny Bible was pronounced dead. His execution brought a measure of closure to a case that had stretched nearly 40 years and a long list of victims. But for many, the true weight of his actions may never fully fade. Carlton Gary, 67, Georgia. On the night of March 15, 2018, Georgia brought a decades-old nightmare to a close. Carlton Gary, infamously known as the Columbus Stocking Strangler, was executed at the age of 67. For more than 40 years, his name had haunted the city of Columbus, etched into its darkest memories. Between 1977 and 1978, a string of brutal attacks shocked the community. Gary had a specific method and a terrifying consistency. He broke into the homes of elderly women, mostly affluent white residents living in the Winton neighborhood. These were women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, attacked as they slept, then assaulted and strangled with their own stockings. In total, at least 7 lives were taken in a series of crimes that paralyzed Columbus in fear. The killing spree ended abruptly when Gary left the area. But years later, in 1984, he was arrested for robbery. Fingerprints at the crime scene connected him to several of the long unsolved murders. That evidence, along with DNA and stolen items, would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. Gary, however, always insisted he was innocent. He blamed the police, claiming racial bias and framing. But courts rejected those claims repeatedly, especially after DNA testing in 2007 further tied him to the killings. For 34 years on death row, Gary never once admitted guilt. And even as the end approached, he held to that narrative. His final meal? Corn dogs, French fries, and a vanilla milkshake. When asked for final words, he looked straight ahead and said, "I want to say I'm innocent. I did not commit these murders. I'll see you on the other side." At 10:33 p.m., Carlton Gary was pronounced dead. And with him, one of Georgia's most horrifying criminal sagas finally ended. Elias Sirianni, 67, North Carolina. In the early hours of November 18, 2005, Elias Hannah Sirianni took his final breath inside Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was 67 years old, executed for a crime that tore his family apart in a way that left scars no court could ever fully heal. The events unfolded on July 28, 1990. That day, Sirianni waited for hours outside the home of his estranged wife, Teresa Yusufani. She had filed for divorce, and the relationship was tense. As she returned home from work, their 10-year-old son John sat beside her in the passenger seat. Sirianni blocked their driveway with his van and, without warning, reached through her car window and attacked her with a screwdriver, stabbing her 28 times. John tried to intervene, but it was too late. Neighbors were horrified. One said it looked as though she had been hit with buckshot. Teresa survived the initial attack but died 28 days later due to a severe brain injury. Initially charged with assault with intent to kill, Sirianni's charge was upgraded to capital murder after her death. At his trial, he claimed he only wanted to speak with her, possibly reconcile, but the facts told a different story. He had brought the weapon, waited patiently, and struck with full intent. The jury sentenced him to death in June 1991. Sirianni spent 15 years on death row. During that time, he expressed remorse and tried to reconnect with his children through letters and spiritual reflection. His final meal was modest: pizza, lasagna, and orange juice. In his last words, Sirianni thanked his children, friends, and even prison staff. His voice trembled with emotion as he said, "I want to thank God first for everything that happened in my life. I want to thank my children. I want to thank my family, especially my sister Odette, and those who supported me during 15 years and 4 months of suffering. I thank everyone." At 2:11 a.m., the execution was carried out, and for the family he shattered, another painful chapter quietly closed. Wesley Iraperky, 68, Indiana Federal. On the morning of July 16, 2020, inside the execution chamber at Terre Haute Federal Correctional Complex, Wesley Iraperky became only the second person executed by the U.S. government after a nearly 2-decade pause on federal executions. He was 68 years old, and his crimes were as unsettling as they were unforgettable. It began in 1998 in Kansas City, Missouri. Jennifer Long, just 16, vanished without a trace. Her mother had been seeing Perky at the time. Behind closed doors, he had been grooming the teen, and on one horrific day, he struck. He assaulted her, then ended her life with a knife. What came next was nothing short of grisly. He used a chainsaw to dismember her body, burned her remains, and dumped what was left into a septic pond. Years later, while serving a life sentence for that crime, Perky was sentenced to death for another murder, one that stunned even hardened investigators. His second victim was 80-year-old Mary Ruth Bales. During a home robbery in Kansas, he beat her to death with a claw hammer. An elderly woman attacked in her own home for no reason other than greed. As his execution approached, Perky's legal team fought hard to stop it. They described a man slipping into psychosis, suffering from schizophrenia and dementia. He reportedly believed his body would be used in post-mortem experiments and that his death was part of a larger conspiracy. Mental health experts backed those claims, but the Supreme Court ruled that he understood why he was being executed, and the sentence was upheld. For his final meal, Perky chose a simple pairing, pecan pie and vanilla ice cream. When asked for his last words, he said softly, "This sanitized murder really does not serve no purpose whatsoever. Thank you." At 8:19 a.m., Wesley Perky was declared dead. For some, it was justice finally served. For others, it was a reminder of the deep moral questions surrounding mental illness, punishment, and closure. Lester Leroy Bauer Jr., 67. On June 3, 2015, after more than 31 years on death row, Lester Leroy Bauer Jr. was executed at the age of 67, one of the longest-serving inmates in Texas death row history. His case had stirred debate for decades, not only because of its complexity, but because of the unwavering claims of innocence that followed him to the very end. The murders took place on October 8, 1983. Inside a remote hangar on a ranch in Sherman, Texas, the bodies of 4 men were discovered: Bob Tate, Philip Good, Jerry Brown, and Ronald Mays. All had been shot in a manner suggesting execution, close range, methodical, and deliberate. But the motive wasn't immediately clear, and the investigation took years to come together. The break came when Bauer's ex-wife contacted authorities. She revealed that her husband had obtained an ultralight aircraft, the same kind that had gone missing from the hangar around the time of the murders. Investigators soon found a trail of circumstantial evidence that led back to Bauer. Prosecutors said he planned the killings to steal the aircraft. But Bauer told a different story. He claimed the meeting had been for a transaction gone wrong involving drugs and that he had acted in self-defense. The jury didn't believe him. As years passed, Bauer appealed again and again. New evidence, alternative theories, and alleged inconsistencies in witness statements were raised, but none swayed the courts. Through every hearing, every filing, and every denial, Bauer stood by his word. He didn't do it. On his final day, Bauer declined a special last meal. But when the moment came to speak, he made sure his words echoed. "I'm innocent. I did not kill those men. I've said this for 31 years. I'll say it again. I'm innocent." At 6:36 p.m., the state of Texas carried out the execution. But long after the drugs had taken effect, questions lingered about evidence, about truth, and about whether justice had been fully served. Thomas Eugene Creech, 74. Idaho ongoing. As of 2025, Thomas Eugene Creech holds a grim distinction. He is not only one of the oldest inmates on death row in America, but he also survived a failed execution attempt, an event that has reignited national debate around the death penalty. Creech's criminal history is long and brutal. In the 1970s, he was convicted of 5 murders committed across multiple states. But the conviction that earned him a death sentence wasn't from the streets. It happened behind prison walls. In 1981, while already serving time in Idaho, Creech killed fellow inmate David Dale Jensen by beating him to death with a sock filled with batteries at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. For that crime, the state sentenced him to die. Fast forward to February 28, 2024. Creech, now 74, was brought into Idaho's execution chamber. But what followed was unlike anything the prison staff had experienced. Over nearly an hour, medical personnel made 8 separate attempts to insert an IV line into his veins, first in his arms, then his legs. Each attempt failed. The execution was eventually called off. The botched procedure made headlines across the country. Not only had Creech outlived the judges and prosecutors who put him on death row, he had now outlasted the system's ability to execute him. After spending 50 years behind bars, questions swirled. Should Idaho try again? Or did the failed attempt cross the line into cruel and unusual punishment? The legal battle is ongoing, and while Creech remains in his cell, the state weighs its next move, and the nation watches closely. David Hosier, 69, Missouri. On June 11, 2024, Missouri carried out the execution of 69-year-old David Hosier, a man whose jealousy and rage turned deadly. His name became synonymous with a double murder that shattered a quiet apartment complex in Jefferson City. The date was September 28, 2009. Angela Gilpin and her husband Rodney had just returned to their apartment when they were ambushed in the parking lot. Angela was shot 7 times, Rodney 4. The shooter, a man from Angela's past. David Hosier had been in a relationship with Angela after her previous marriage ended. But when she reunited with Rodney, Hosier didn't let go. In the months leading up to the murders, he had stalked Angela, left threatening messages, and obsessively tracked her life. Eventually, he made a fatal decision. Driving from Indiana to Missouri with a trunk full of weapons, Hosier waited outside their home. When the couple arrived, he opened fire. Then he fled to Oklahoma, sparking a high-speed chase and exchange of gunfire with police before finally being captured. Inside his vehicle, officers found 15 firearms, including the one used in the murder. At trial, prosecutors detailed his threats and obsession. The jury took little time to find him guilty and recommended the ultimate sentence, death. On the day of his execution, Hosier requested a bacon cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake, classic comfort food for a man who had spent nearly 15 years awaiting this moment. When asked for final words, he said, "I'm innocent, but I'm at peace. To Angela's family, I hope you can find peace." At 6:11 p.m., David Hosier was pronounced dead, bringing closure to a case that had begun with love, spiraled into obsession, and ended in irrevocable loss. James Barney Hubbard, 74. On August 5, 2004, Alabama carried out the execution of one of its oldest death row inmates, 74-year-old James Barney Hubbard. After nearly 3 decades on death row, Hubbard's long, winding journey through the justice system came to an end at Holman Correctional Facility. The crime that sealed his fate happened on January 10, 1977, in Tuscaloosa. Lillian Montgomery, a 62-year-old store clerk, was working alone when Hubbard entered the shop. He demanded money. She handed over what she had, less than $200, but instead of leaving, Hubbard pulled the trigger. 3 shots echoed through the small store, leaving Montgomery to die on the cold floor she had worked on for years. Hubbard's background painted a disturbing pattern. His criminal record stretched back to the 1940s, filled with robbery and assault convictions. He was already on parole at the time of Lillian's murder, free, despite a history that showed a man capable of violence. As the years ticked by, Hubbard became a fixture on death row, known as the grandfather among inmates due to his age and white hair. He spent his days quietly reading, watching television, and exchanging letters with pen pals around the country. When execution day arrived, Hubbard requested a Southern-style meal: fried chicken, French fries, coleslaw, banana pudding, and sweet tea. His final words were humble and sorrowful. "I apologize to the victim's family. I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. I'm ready to go home to the Lord." At 6:16 p.m., he was pronounced dead. And with that, the state of Alabama closed the book on a life marked by crime and a murder that forever changed a family. Brandon Astor Jones, 72, Georgia. On February 3, 2016, Georgia executed 72-year-old Brandon Astor Jones, bringing an end to one of the longest death row waits in American history. He had spent 36 years awaiting this moment, his case winding through courtrooms and appeals for nearly 4 decades. It all began on June 17, 1979. In the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Roger Tackett was finishing a late-night shift managing a Texaco gas station. He was a father, just 35 years old. That night, Brandon Jones and accomplice Van Roosevelt Solomon walked in with robbery on their minds. Tackett complied. He gave them the money. But that wasn't enough. Jones opened fire, shooting Tackett multiple times through the arms, the legs, and the head. It was an act of cold finality, even after they'd already gotten what they wanted. Both Jones and Solomon were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. Solomon's execution was carried out swiftly in 1985, but Jones remained on death row year after year, pursuing appeal after appeal. During his decades in prison, Jones underwent a transformation of sorts. He became an avid writer, penning essays, opinion pieces, and even full manuscripts, blending fiction with autobiography. His words reached readers far beyond prison walls. When his execution day arrived, Jones chose not to request a special last meal. He was served the standard prison dinner: chicken and rice, greens, beans, cornbread, bread pudding, and fruit punch. He declined to speak before his execution, instead choosing a final prayer to be read aloud. At 11:17 a.m., Brandon Astor Jones was pronounced dead. A chapter had finally ended, one that began with violence in a gas station and echoed across courtrooms, advocacy circles, and death row for more than 36 years. Clarence Ray Allen, 76, California. In the early hours of January 17, 2006, Clarence Ray Allen took his final breath inside San Quentin State Prison. At 76, he was nearly deaf, legally blind, diabetic, and confined to a wheelchair. But none of that could erase the legacy of violence that followed him right into the execution chamber. Allen wasn't just another death row inmate. His case stood out for one chilling reason. He ordered multiple murders after he was already serving a life sentence for one. Back in 1974, Allen owned a small security company and had used his expertise to plan a burglary at Fran's Market in Fresno. He'd even installed their alarm system. With inside knowledge and the help of his son, he managed to pull off the heist, stealing cash and thousands in money orders. But then came a crack in the silence. 17-year-old Mary Sue Kitts, who helped cash some of the stolen money orders, told a friend what had happened. Allen, fearing exposure, decided to silence her. He tried poisoning her first, but when that failed, he ordered one of his accomplices to strangle her. Her body was dumped in a canal and never found. In 1977, Allen was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life. But prison didn't stop him. From his cell at Folsom State Prison, he plotted revenge against the witnesses who helped convict him. He passed a hit list to a fellow inmate, Billy Ray Hamilton, who was due for parole. Allen's message was clear: tie up the loose ends. On September 5, 1980, Hamilton walked into Fran's Market with a sawed-off shotgun. What followed was a massacre. He killed Brian Schlavowitz, a key witness, along with two teenage employees, Douglas White and Josephine Rocha. Two more people were shot but survived. Allen was tried again, this time for the murders he ordered behind bars, and sentenced to death. Over the years, he became the oldest person on California's death row. His defense argued that executing a severely ill elderly man was cruel and unusual, but the courts allowed it to proceed. For his final meal, Allen chose buffalo steak, Kentucky Fried Chicken, sugar-free pecan pie, sugar-free vanilla ice cream, and whole milk. His last words were poetic and haunting. "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much. I love you all. Goodbye." At 12:38 a.m., Clarence Ray Allen was pronounced dead, closing the file on a man whose crimes continued even when he was behind locked doors. Murray Hooper, 76, Arizona. On November 16, 2022, after 42 years on Arizona's death row, Murray Hooper was executed at Florence State Prison. At 76, he had spent over half his life fighting the sentence and proclaiming his innocence. His story began on New Year's Eve, 1980. In Phoenix, businessman Pat Redmond and his family were preparing to ring in the new year when three men forced their way into the home. Pat, his wife Marilyn, and his mother-in-law Helen Phelps were tied up with duct tape and shot in the head, execution style. Pat and Helen didn't survive, but somehow Marilyn did, and her testimony would become the backbone of the case. The attack wasn't random. Investigators said it was a targeted hit arranged by Robert Cruz, who co-owned a printing company with Redmond. According to prosecutors, Cruz hired Hooper, William Bracey, and Edward McCall to eliminate his partner over a business dispute. Hooper and the others were convicted and sentenced to death. But the legal fallout was complicated. Bracey died in prison. McCall's sentence was later reduced. And Cruz? He was tried 3 times and eventually acquitted. But Hooper's conviction stood. Over the next 4 decades, Hooper fought his sentence with everything he had. His lawyers argued that critical evidence had been hidden and that witness identifications were shaky at best. Still, the courts upheld the verdict. On execution day, Hooper chose 2 bacon cheeseburgers, a side of fries, and a vanilla milkshake for his final meal. And when it was time to speak, he offered parting words that reflected calm and defiance. "It's all been said. Let it be done. To all my lawyers and loved ones, don't be sad for me. Don't cry. Don't say goodbye, but say, I'll see you later. Let's go." At 10:34 a.m., Murray Hooper was pronounced dead, ending one of the longest-running death row cases in Arizona's history and leaving behind a case that still stirs questions about justice, evidence, and time. Carl Wayne Bunchen, Texas. On April 21, 2022, Carl Wayne Bunchen was put to death at the Huntsville unit in Texas. At 78, he became the oldest person ever executed in the state's modern era. But age didn't erase the past, and Bunchen's past was long, violent, and deeply scarring. The crime that brought him to death row happened over 3 decades earlier, on June 27, 1990. Houston motorcycle officer James Irby had pulled Bunchen's car over for a routine traffic stop. Irby, a 37-year-old father of 2, walked up to the vehicle and began speaking with the passenger. In a flash, Bunchen stepped out, pulled a gun, and shot Officer Irby once in the head. As the officer fell to the ground, Bunchen fired 2 more rounds into his back, sealing the officer's fate before fleeing the scene. But Bunchen was no stranger to violence. Back in 1961, he had been convicted of killing a man during a robbery. He was on parole for that murder when he killed Officer Irby. During his trial, witnesses testified that the murder had been cold and deliberate. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, including Bunchen's long rap sheet filled with armed robberies and assaults. The jury needed little convincing. He was sentenced to death. For the next 32 years, Bunchen remained on death row. Over time, he became a symbol of how slow the justice system can move. As his health declined, marked by frailty and a long list of medical issues, his lawyers argued that executing someone so old and ill served no purpose. But the state of Texas pressed forward. On the day of his execution, Bunchen offered a statement filled with remorse. "I wanted the Irby family to know one thing. I do have remorse for what I did. I pray to God that they get the closure for me killing their father and Miss Irby's husband. To all of my friends that stuck with me through all of these years, I am not going to say goodbye. Just saying so long. I am ready to go to heaven." At 6:39 p.m., Carl Wayne Bunchen was pronounced dead, ending one of the longest and most controversial stays on Texas's death row. John B. Nixon, 77, Mississippi. On December 14, 2005, Mississippi executed 17-year-old John B. Nixon, a man who orchestrated a cold-blooded killing for hire at the age of 57 and who would become one of the oldest people ever put to death post-1970s. The murder took place on January 22, 1985. Virginia Tucker had recently remarried, starting a new chapter in her life with her husband, Thomas Tucker. But someone from her past couldn't let go. Her ex-husband, Stir Pontier, wanted her dead, and he was willing to pay for it. Nixon, along with his son and an accomplice, took the job. They showed up at Virginia's home late at night. Nixon carried a .22 caliber pistol. When he walked in, he reportedly told the couple, "I brought y'all something." Thomas Tucker, realizing the danger, tried to offer Nixon money, but Nixon coldly replied, "That's not what I'm after. The deal's already been made." Thomas was shot but survived. Virginia wasn't so lucky. Nixon took the pistol, held it behind her head, and pulled the trigger as an accomplice restrained her. The men fled, but Thomas, wounded and desperate, identified Nixon. The web quickly unraveled. Gilbert Jimenez, one of the accomplices, turned state's witness and testified against the others. Nixon's own sons were implicated in planning the hit, while Stir Pontier, the man who funded it, was sentenced to life. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury took just 30 minutes to convict and less than 2 hours to sentence Nixon to death. For 2 decades on death row, Nixon filed appeal after appeal. His attorneys argued that his advanced age and declining health made execution inhumane, but the courts held firm. On his final day, Nixon requested a hearty Southern meal. A well-done T-bone steak, buttered asparagus, baked potato with sour cream, pecan pie, and vanilla ice cream. When given the chance to speak his last words, Nixon apologized, though not without casting doubt. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry to the world. I'm sorry for myself, and I'm sorry to the family. I did not kill Virginia Tucker. I know within my heart, and it hurts to acknowledge that it was a son of mine and a Spanish friend and another man from Jackson." But the evidence and the verdict left no room for doubt. At 6:25 p.m., John B. Nixon was pronounced dead. The man who once took a life for a paycheck had now paid with his own. From John David Battaglia to John B. Nixon, these stories remind us that justice, no matter how delayed, eventually arrives, sometimes after decades of courtroom battles, solitary cells, and final meals. Each case is unique, yet they all share common threads: lives lost, families shattered, and legal systems stretched across time. Some of these men met their end insisting on innocence. Others offered remorse, and a few showed none at all. Many were elderly, frail, and long removed from the crimes they committed. But age doesn't undo tragedy, and a quiet execution doesn't silence the ripple effects of violence. We've seen cases marked by vengeance, obsession, mental illness, and even government failure. Some verdicts sparked closure, others questions. But what they all leave behind is a sobering look at the ultimate punishment and the human stories entangled within it. These are not just statistics. These are real people, victims, families, and even perpetrators whose lives were changed forever. If you found this content powerful or thought-provoking, help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime content. Like this video to show your support. Share it with others who care about justice and the human stories behind the headlines. Comment below. Which case impacted you the most? Do you think justice was served? Thanks for watching, and remember, behind every headline is a story worth understanding.